Good morning, and welcome to my blog, Wisdom for Today. And I'm so glad that you decided to join me today, this Valentine's Day. Now, I told you last month that every third week we would talk about a character from history on my blog who affected Christianity. And last month, in the month of January, we talked about George Washington Carver. And as a young black man, how he transcended so many barriers put in front of him to glorify Jesus Christ in education and in his personal witness and amidst the terrible plague of polio and beyond in all of his inventions in biophysics. But since it's Valentine's Day today, I wanted to talk to you about a love story because I want to talk to you about a woman that changed history, but she did so in a love story. And I cannot imagine why this has not been made into a movie. It's the love story between Martin Luther and his wife, Katie. So, Katie, when she was a young girl at the age of 6, her mother died, and she was placed into a boarding school. At the age of 9, she was moved into a convent because she was closer to an age of being a young woman. And at the age of 16, she took vows. Now, whether those vows were voluntary or compulsory, we don't know. We know that her father didn't want her home. And then the Reformation took place. And during the Reformations, there were a lot of nuns who were having prayer meetings, and we forget about this, before Martin Luther even nailed his 95 Theses to the wall. There were Christians who were asking for revival, and Katie was one of those nuns. And they started to write Martin Luther because they knew that he was preaching this new gospel of salvation by grace and grace alone. And they wanted to be a part of it, and they wanted to escape convent life. And many did escape. They were caught and severely punished, and they were returned. So Katie Luther arranged with Martin Luther through mail to have a merchant come to their convent. And with barrels that were usually filled with ale and alcoholic beverages, these 12 nuns escaped convent life. And when Martin Luther got them, he decided to arrange marriages for them because in those days that was the only way a woman could live. And he arranged a lot of the marriages with young clergymen. Now, he had different get-togethers so these women can get to know these men, and that's the way marriage was done in those days anyway. So it was mutual choice, but they were arranged marriages. Katie fell in love with one of the young ministers who came to one of these get-togethers, but he married someone else. And then Martin Luther, because she was such a dynamic woman, she was so organized, and she took such great leadership roles, said he would work really hard to arrange for a husband for her. And she blatantly told him that she would marry no one but him. Now, Martin Luther wasn't against marriage, but he knew that his role in this world was tenuous. There were people who wanted his life. He had already been arrested once and threatened with capital punishment, and he felt it irresponsible of him to take a wife, and he told Katie so. And then Katie said that she would remain single and work for the church. But then the Pope came out with a statement condemning Protestant clergy for marrying, and it kind of angered Martin Luther. And he said, "I'll take Kate as my wife ere I die." And Kate threw herself into that position with her whole heart and her whole life. They lived in a little broken down monastery, which she created a garden in it. And she worked tirelessly to have Martin Luther's works published. Now, Martin Luther was a great preacher, but he wasn't very organized in getting his literature out there. So she would invite young seminarians, young men who wanted to go into the ministry, into these big dinners she would have, and she would take notes of what Martin Luther talked to them about, and she would publish those notes, and they were called table talk, and they brought the family a small income. She also worked at her garden, and she raised pigs, and she raised cows, and some people say she financed the Reformation, because the money not only went to support her household, but also the household of other young clergy who were not being paid at the time. But she endured her fair share of criticism. She was criticized constantly for breaking her convent vows, which she said that now she had vows to her husband, and her vows to God were first. And she even argued for salvation by grace, and that those old vows were archaic and were not found in Scripture. But people got cruel. They even predicted the deaths of her children, and she had 6 children, and they predicted that one of her children would be the Antichrist. And sadly, in the turn of events, 2 of her kids would succumb to the plague and die. When Martin was away from the family in his ministry, but Katie sojourned on. Martin wasn't a healthy man, probably because of the pressure of being the first reformer. And she nursed him most of his life. But near the end, when she got influenza and it settled in her lungs to pneumonia, it was he that nursed her until she died. During their life, Katie would often call Martin Luther Dr. Luther because he was embarrassed of his education. And he would return by calling her Dr. Katie, or my Lord Katie, or Katie my boss. He said that his marriage tested his character because there were rocky roads. Both of them married later in life, and there was some considerable arguments. But there was also passionate love. Katie Luther and Martin Luther set the precedence that clergy could serve God and also be married. Although, as you know, because I'm your pastor, we can also be single in this world. But the great joy of Katie Luther is that she went on and faced great obstacles. People say that Martin Luther used her organizational skills for the Reformation. But when I read her life and the love letters between them, I think she used Luther to serve Jesus Christ. In fact, both of them served Jesus Christ together. Often when people talk about Katie Luther, they often quote Proverbs 31 about the woman who gets up early and works and provides for her household. And I agree, that does describe Katie Luther. But I also think 1 Corinthians 13 does. Now this passage is thrown around a lot near Valentine's Day. But I want you to think of this woman that persevered amidst all the trials that she was given. And it was not only just her love for her husband, which was considerable, but it was her love for Jesus Christ in the ministry. You know, before I read this passage, there was once that Luther got angry because he was getting so much criticism. And he stopped spending his time in prayer. And Katie Luther went into her wardrobe and she wore black and put on a black veil. And Martin came in while she was crying and said, "Who died?" And she says, "God has died in your life, my husband." She was someone whose love for God and love for the ministry inspired her love for her husband. So as we talk about love, I want you to think of Katie Luther's love for God and love for her husband. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy. It does not boast. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Now, when we talk about this love, Paul's using the word agape. And this is really descriptive of the love of God. But he was giving it to Christians in the house of Corinth, in 1 Corinthians. He was giving it to them because they were fighting over ridiculous things. And he was saying it's possible for you to attain this kind of love. I think Katie Luther did, in spite of her fights with her husband, in spite of the relentless and cruel criticism and ridicule she received. And she went on to live a happy life. Brothers and sisters, as we serve Jesus Christ and serve the people we love during this Valentine's Day, may we not forget that all love comes from God. And all God requires of us is to take one step at a time in loving others and loving Him. Have a happy Valentine's Day and serve God all the day long. God's blessings, and I hope to see you on Sunday.